Hello and welcome to a very special episode, one that is not actually listed in the lineup yet, but it will be, of Essence Podcast. And my guest today is Lee Harrington. Welcome, Lee Harrington.
A delight to be here.
Wonderful to see you. So, for those of you who don't know who Lee Harrington is, and you should be by now, but if you don't, Lee Harrington is an internationally known sexuality, relationships, and personal authenticity educator. Having taught in all 50 states and across 7 countries, he brings a combination of playful engagement and thoughtful academic dialogue to a broad audience. An award-winning author and editor on human gender, sexual, and sacred experience, his books include Traversing Gender, Understanding Transgender Journeys, Sacred Kink, The Eightfold Path of BDSM and Beyond, and Shibari. Shibari You Can Use, Japanese rope bondage and erotic macrame, among many other titles. He's been blogging online since 1998 and been teaching worldwide since 2001. You can check out Lee's adventures and as well as his regular podcast, tour schedule, free essays, videos, and more over at www.passionandsoul.com. And I'll place that down in the bottom along with Lee's other socials. And today we're going to be talking a little bit, I'm sure, among many things, their new book, Become Your Own Beloved, A Guide to Delighting in Self-Connection, which is now currently available and out. So, Lee, welcome to the show.
Oh, such a joy to get to be here. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. You've been on my list to interview for a very long time. I just didn't know how to best connect. And when you put out the call a few months ago, about looking for opportunities, I knew I just had to take it. So I'm really pleased that you're with me.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
love this series that you're doing. As someone who, in the newest book, got a chance to share stories from my mother and grandmother, and others along my ancestral line. As someone who my ancestral altar and the stories of those who have passed both of my ancestors of blood and my ancestors of love and heart lineage, like it is such a passionate topic for me, and I am excited for your new book, and this whole series you've been doing is great.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's funny. We were chatting beforehand about how books tend to become like children to us, and 2 years of working on this book, I feel like it's ready to go off to college. How long? So this newest book of yours, which is currently right behind you, how long have you been working on this one now? I'm curious.
Oh, so my first essay on the topic was right after I met this amazing person named Rose. I was on a performance tour along with Catherine Valente, who is a fantasy author who wrote a book called Palimpsest back in the day. They've since had a lot of YA novels and mystery novels and whatnot, but this was 12, 13 years ago. And they did a story called Palimpsest that I refer to being about a sexually transmitted city. It's an amazing fairy world, dark fairy world kind of experience. And I was on tour with them doing stage shows that went along with the book. And I talked with this beautiful being named Rose, a non binary person, and they told me that they'd gotten married to themselves. And I'm like, okay, you got to tell me more about that. That's fascinating. Uh, and they told me all about their journey. And I ended up thinking about it a lot after I got home. And I'd been recently divorced. I was a performance artist. I had a lot of self connection challenges and figuring out how I liked me or didn't like me. And so I was like, you know what? Let's do this. Let's do this as performance art. Let's do this as healing from past relationship. Let's do this as all of this stuff, not because they were toxic things. I still love my former husband, but because they were things that needed healed. I ordered a ring. I had 5 oaths that I was going to share with myself, put on the inside of it, 5 words, and uh, and then the ring showed up, and I had a crisis. I had an emotional crisis, which was that I wasn't sure if I asked me to marry me, if I would say yes.
Mm. Yes.
And I had some folks be like, well, what do you mean? And so I ended up writing a blog entry about it. I ended up talking about it with folks of like, I've realized I don't know if I like me. I don't know how I feel about the fact that I have a deep spiritual connection and that the gods like me, and how do I feel about that? Like, it created this huge conundrum, and it sat on my desk for 4 months before I finally was in San Francisco, popped the question, and I said yes. But it was this strange emotional, psychological, spiritual self exploration that led to me then talking with folks about it and getting a chance to have my wedding to myself out in the woods. And then I had more conversations about it. And then I did more writing. And it became this fluid piece for over 12 years. And for my patrons, I wrote another chapter of it. I wrote a whole outline. I wasn't sure where it was going to go. And I then had a publisher at Twin Flame get a hold of me, who's an imprint of Post Hill Press. And Twin Flame got a hold of me and said, "Hey, what do you have right now? We really like your other work, but what's a fit for this new imprint?" And so I gave them a whole lot of ideas, and I'm sure you've had this too, where it's like the brain, like, I at least have a list of like, well, I could write on this, well, maybe I could write on that. And so I threw some ideas at them, and as soon as I brought up this idea, on the other end of the phone, she said, "Stop! I don't want to hear anything else. I want to hear about this. I want to hear about this in relation to right now being in the midst of a pandemic." Because I was writing it during that time period. Like, I want to hear about this in relationship to people's perception that self-love means you have to leave community and you have to do this all alone. I want to hear all this stuff that I was mentioning to her. And so I spent the last year and a half, 2 years if you include all the editing, um, helping this child be my brain baby, because 12 years of conversation is a beautiful thing. And there's something different that happens in the written word, because in the same way as with a fantasy novel, if somebody picks up my book, they are reading their life between the lines.
Mm.
They're painting their story into it. Um, and I think there's something really powerful getting a chance to create a journey with someone who I'll never meet. So I think for me, that's both the chronology of it and the beauty that comes having a thing that I'll never get to have a conversation in, but I'll get to facilitate a possibility crafted.
I'm really, really pleased that you raised that, because I was going to ask you what that experience, like crafting something slightly different from what the bulk of your work has been. So much of your work around kink and even sacred sexuality, that piece around relating to others and then relating to self. This is all about self. And I think you said this to Halo a couple of weeks ago on their podcast. I think you said there's a difference between self-love with a capital S and selfish love.
Mm.
And if you didn't say that, I think it's something you would probably say. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that I think that this notion of self, capital S,
Mm,
self, is to look at the idea of who I am on both a personal level and the cosmic level.
mm,
The power that comes in seeing the fullness of who I am, the me that is my body, the me that is my mind, the me that is my spirit, the me that is part of the cosmic all, the part of me that is past lives and future lives of me, the self. it's as compared to this notion of I am putting myself first, which I have a belief that if I actually put myself capitalized first, or as part of at least the things I'm worrying about in life and thinking about in life, I must inherently keep others in mind because I am not a solitary being. Somebody told me years ago that there are individuals who, in their past lives, it is a direct translation to where they are now. But that for a lot of us, it's dumping our essence back into the river of all of possibility. And in the next life, we scoop back out and have the next possibility of us. And it can explain, therefore, why 20 different people have shared memory from a past life. It's because some of us carry different bits rather than carrying all of self, right? That whole entity forward. But if we look at the idea of this river of possibility, this river of dream, this river of existence, if we come from that framework, my self, capitalized, must be part of a communal experience, must be part of a historical experience, must be tapped into all of the generations that come from here. That my skin and blood literally carries 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And that is not selfish. That is being inherently part of myself.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. It's curious thinking in that way then about those other forms of relationship, in how you were just talking before about how in creating this book and creating this facilitating this potential journey for whoever's reading and being in relationship with them, but not being in relationship with them in ways that you're used to relating to your readership. What
Yeah.
was that like for you setting up? Because so many of your teaching work, I mean, right, very soon you're going to be heading up to Alaska, you're going to be going to Berlin, you're going to be all over the place. What was it like crafting this, and what was that experience like for you?
Part of it was the beauty of getting to have people who already believed in me.
Mm-hmm.
That I was able to post an outline on my Patreon page, which has about 200 folks on it right now. And having these 200 folks be like, oh yeah, that totally worked. Or what in the world are you talking about? I don't get it. And I'm like, oh, thank you for your delicious and deeply challenging
Yes.
honesty. Because I appreciate honesty and authenticity. Like it's something that
Yes.
I curate in my social circles around
Mhm.
me. But sometimes it is uncomfortable. And getting to post outlines to stuff and getting to share ideas and getting to have classes slash discussions ahead of time
Mhm.
and and having that group of folks who believed in me was a really beautiful part of it, a really important part. uh, Another was getting to sit down with myself, my past self, and go, if I were my own ancestor, if the me that got married 12 years ago and did that blog entry, if I were sitting down with that lovely creature, what might they say? And if they don't speak back, what is it like to light a candle energetically or physically to that part of me that needs to speak again? Because me 12 years later doesn't remember how challenging it was. And I have an exercise that's in the book that is literally association questions. It's one of those, ask yourself 1,000 questions. What's your favorite holiday? What's your this? But some of them are really hard ones. And I think part of it was inviting that part of my history to get to speak again, because that's not who I speak as anymore. I've gone on a whole journey. But the person picking up a book is at the place where I was 12 years, 14 years ago.
Right. Right.
And so instead of saying, I mean, it's the same thing that I have when I teach SM classes,
Mhm.
BDSM classes, that I feel so blessed by somebody that I had dated for a while that I said, yeah, we're going to talk about this thing and this thing and this thing. And
Mm.
they looked at me and said, you do know that that's not BDSM 101, right? And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And they're like, yeah, like saying you can just tie someone up in this way isn't real for a lot of people.
Mhm.
The 101 is admitting that you have any fantasies at all.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah.
End of sentence. Not about even the activities,
Yeah.
just admitting that you have desires.
Yeah.
And then part two is then admitting it to your partner, if
Yes.
you even have the courage.
Hmm.
And I went, oh, my 101 is most people's 201.
Hmm.
And her bravery saying that to me allowed me to level up as a teacher. And so I wasn't even aware that I was doing the thing. And so taking that bravery from her and stopping, going, okay, my 101 about self connection is at a very different place than the person who's going to pick up this book. Mind you, there's a lot of people who are at a place like myself who will still pick it up and be like, oh, I need to read the chapter on self forgiveness because that's where you're at in your relationship with you.
Makes sense.
But there's a lot of folks that needed to pick up something like this and be able to say a word association game of what's my favorite color?
Hmm.
What is my favorite food? What's the last time I lied to myself?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right. And weave them
Yeah,
in with the
that's a
same
really good
value
question.
level. Because I don't know about you, but when's the last time you asked yourself what your favorite color is?
It's a good question. I,
Because
I mean, I hear you, Vo. I hear you. Yes, it's something that we don't tend to ask ourselves because we know ourselves, right?
right.
Yeah.
And I mean, that question itself came for me when I had a therapist. I was dealing with mood disorder adventures in my own system, and I decided to do a year-long outpatient program because my brain was not okay. And I had a therapist say, well, what is your favorite color? And I had an emotional breakdown
Mm.
because I didn't know if the answer I gave when I was 6 years old was still true.
Right. Right.
And that's when I also had this moment where I was like, nobody asks you what your favorite color.
It's
At least
true.
not often enough. They ask 60-year-olds, but they don't ask 40-year-olds.
Even if they ask that question, how often are they actually listening? Even if they ask
Ooh,
these
good
questions, right?
point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think that applies really well when we're talking about the notion of selfish versus
Hmm.
myself. Is if you believe that other humans don't listen, or if your experience is that other people don't listen, why
Hmm.
are we caring about the rest of our system,
Oh,
with our system being a universal construct?
absolutely. I say it every single day with most of my clients, I'll be honest with you.
Hmm.
Part of
What's one of
my,
the things that comes up?
hmm? I'm
What's one
sorry.
of the things that you found?
Majority of the so I niche and I work mostly with the queer community. The vast majority of people coming in, they're either fitting into a gender journey. A lot of my clients are on gender journeys right now, and a lot of clients they tend to be kind of coming just because they have other peripheral things in their life they want to work on. The queer issue is not an issue for them, right? But
Mm-hmm.
for those who are on a journey, a sexuality journey, a gender journey, majority of the time is suddenly they're in a space where they have somebody who is giving them rapt attention, who is asking them good questions,
Mm.
who is listening, really listening, and they can fill that space. But the barrier, like you were saying, the barrier there is this actually safe for me to talk about? Am I suddenly going to be cut off, questioned, talked over, all of those things?
Yeah, that's beautifully stated. And because I know a lot of folks who refer to therapy as being paid perspective. But I think it's also the power of having someone listen or care.
Yes.
And it's one of the things that I found so interesting over the course of the lockdown and the pandemic, etc., which we acknowledge is not over, and we are at a different chapter of it because
Yes.
of vaccines. But it is certainly not over, and I will name that especially for friends of mine who are immune compromised.
Mhm.
Uh, but during this was who understood that wearing a mask and not going outside will save someone else's life? And how does that relate to your relationship with yourself? Because my punchline, I have realized out of this book, I realized after like 30 conversations about the topic after I'd written the book. And it's that moment where you're just like, why couldn't I have known this before I wrote the book? Because this would have been really great material. Um, but the realization that self-love isn't enough. It's about building self-relationship. And
Yes.
part of that is building relationship
Yes.
with others, with the world at large, with the
Mhm.
whatever it might be. And talking with folks in the world of kink, Z Griss, whose website is embodymorelove.com. Check out Z's work, it's amazing. But Z talks about this idea of relationship with ourselves, if you are kinky, can be about self submission or self dominance. That could be the shape of your relationship. It doesn't have to be romantic, your relationship with self, but it could be about the idea of submitting to your greater will.
Yes.
It could be about setting yourself up for success. What's it like instead of being like, I can sleep in another 40 hours? Maybe that's just me. I don't know. But I could sleep another 40 hours as compared to being like, well, if you're serving, if your relationship with yourself is the act of service, serving you might look like getting up at 9 a.m. instead of 11 a.m. Those of you who are 6 a.m. people, I'm sorry if I'm offending you. But getting up at 9 a.m. and having an actual full breakfast and taking a shower and breathing for 30 minutes or 5 minutes before we hop on our smartphones. That's what your relationship with self might look like. Or I was talking with a computer programmer recently. They were trying to have me come on for to speak at a conference on building apps, and I'm like, wow, that's so out of my wheelhouse, but I'm willing to give it a try. Um, but they were talking about what's it like if you got to be your own rubber duck slash your own teammate on building a project. For so many people that are the relationship with themselves needs to be their own co-worker.
Yes. Yes.
And I know a lot of pagans for whom it would be so powerful of what would it be like to be in a coven with yourself,
Huge thing.
to hold,
Yes.
be in
Yeah.
that circle with yourself, where you lighting that candle in front of your ancestral altar is all of you
Yes.
showing up to light that candle, rather than the 5% of you that's left over
Mm.
after a day of work that's causing a toll upon your heart. What
Absolutely.
would that be like?
It's a
I don't
good.
have an answer, but I think it's pretty cool.
Well, it raises an interesting point. One of the kind of interesting things I've noticed in my work is that people often don't feel they have the permission to get to know themselves. So much
Oof.
pushed into the shadow, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
self is really intangible because it's scary. It's scary to get to know self. And I notice in your a lot of your exercises, like I just flipped it open before. There was one I really loved, which was the pen pal exercise. Love the pen pal exercise. Um, Getting to know each other, right? Getting to know self, but becoming tangible. One of the amazing pieces around ancestor work, one of the lessons I learned, anyways, came from Confucianism. Confucius, who was massive in Chinese culture. He said that the benefit of ancestral veneration is in learning to serve the intangible. You learn to serve the tangible better. And as soon as
Wow,
I
that
read
just,
that, right, it hits, doesn't it?
yeah, that's stunning.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
it
tastes
hits.
so true to me.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think my practice is not necessarily ancestral veneration. It's more of ancestral relation. And part of that is actually stepping outside of veneration into acknowledging our ancestors as being as complex as we are. And that not all of our ancestors need to be on our altar. Or if they are, we can acknowledge and invite them into our home with as much comfort or as much shielding as we might have when they lived, even if they lived 500 years ago. And I think when you're talking about that idea of venerating others allows us to venerate ourselves, I think there's a parallel for me in my practice of the idea of acknowledging myself as complex
Absolutely.
as my ancestors are slash were.
Mm-hmm.
That I can acknowledge that there's parts of my past that don't need a seat at the table today.
Mm-hmm.
There's a part of my current that might not be serving where I want to go, but that doesn't mean it's not part of me. And that doesn't mean it's not part of my lineages. I can't say, oh, that's so and so who was a murderer. I can just write them off and not have them part of any part of my lineage. Nope. Nope. I have murderers and all kinds of folks who are in my lineage. And if I write all of it off, what of me am I writing off too? Yeah, I'm gonna have to sit with that Confucius piece. Thank you for that gift.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. In reading parts of your book, I was very lucky to have access to it. In reading parts of your book, you speak about that piece in there around service, but you also speak around those pieces of those parts that we might not want to be in relationship with. Can you talk a little bit about that process? What was that like for you as writer, writing this thing?
Part of that process for me in my own relationship with myself is has been about seeing that the things we carry and the activities that we've done in our life happened for a reason. And those aren't all good reasons. Those aren't all wanted reasons. Those aren't, and they don't have to be things we necessarily carry forward all the time, but there's a something that happened. Like parts of dissociating in my life at some point in my childhood were serving a good for me. Not necessarily healthy, but was serving myself because living present every single moment of every single day was not safe for my mind, for my body, or my spirit. But I'm in my 40s now. Disassociating in those ways doesn't serve me today. But what I see a lot of folks do, including me,
Mm.
is get mad at that part of ourselves and go, oh, why am I still dissociating? Why am I so, this is such a problematic thing I'm doing. I need to stop it. How do I purge this? And the process for me instead was, how do I figure out how to say thank you? Thank you, part of me that protected me. Thank you, part of my brain. Thank you, part of my heart. Thank you, part of my spirit. Thank you, part of my body that went, you know what? It's better if you're not here now. Thank you for serving us, slash me. Thank you for the hard work you did. It must have been really hard to come up with that answer. You must have been going through a really hard time. Thank you for this gift. And by the way, you don't have to do that right now. I know you're comfortable with it, and thank you for doing it. And you don't have to do it right now. You can take a nap for right now. And I promise, I make a commitment to you, that part of me, that if this skill needs to exist in my life anymore, I promise that I'll call on you because you are powerful and smart and beautiful. And you came up with something amazing to protect us. And I hope nothing happens where I need this again, but I acknowledge that you're there. Thank you. And I think that process for me, especially the I commit to pull you back out if shit goes sideways.
Yes.
Because especially as a transgender person living in the United States right now, especially as somebody who is queer, especially as somebody who's pagan, especially as a person who lives in other marginalized identities, I acknowledge that there's a part that I could end up living in the next 30 years, depending on how politics goes. I acknowledge there's a part of me that might need that skill set again to exist. And so instead of saying, go away, I'll never want you again, to say thank you and say, I promise that I'm not kicking you out forever and that I acknowledge you. You can keep existing even if we don't do anything together. And yeah, that's been a big part of my process.
It really comes through. That really comes through just in looking at kind of the flow, even just the flow of the of how you've organized this. I mean, you start out with getting to know self. Hello, old friend, meeting yourself anew. You end up with coming home. I'm curious then, with that piece around connecting to those parts that may not be as needed, but are still important. I see this all the time. Inner critic is one of the biggest ones for
Inner
people.
critic, yes,
Inner
absolutely.
critic is one of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
What does home look like for you after going through this process? What did home look like for you coming home? If that makes sense.
It keeps happening.
Yeah.
It's not a, yay, you've done the book and you are well done. You survived the dragon. You have earned this much XP. You are finished with your adventure. Gosh, do I wish some days that that was the case? Yeah, but
Wonderful.
our lives are an ongoing campaign, not a one-time quest. And for the nerds that are in the room, as it were. For me, it's about, home has been about finding capacity to listen to new pieces of wisdom. One of the things I did at the end of the book was that for each of the, did you enjoy this kind of chapter? Here's some people to turn to other than me, because I'm one voice.
Yes.
Right. And I'm like, oh, you're somebody who learns really well through cartoons and stuff. Go check out the folks over at Self Love Rainbow.
Right.
You're somebody who loves music. Go check out the work of Superman, right? And listen to some amazing indigenous music, right? You really enjoy YouTube videos. Check out these TED Talks. And to me, that was about making sure that I am saying to myself, you're part of a bigger self. We are part of being on this planet. I strongly believe we are not alone. even if you are alone at home physically, you are not alone. And the power in that on a spiritual level for me is really key in doing that ongoing work.
That's I'm really taken away with that piece around understanding you're not alone, understanding that we are creations, co-creations
Mm,
of so many other. I have to keep telling myself that it's co-creative, not created. One of the parts of my own book is expanding the idea of ancestor to include fictional characters, superheroes, Emily Bronte. Oh, not Emily Bronte. One of Emily Bronte's characters, right? All of these other figures, real or not, um, that co-create who we are at points in our lives, right? To go back to some of those past relationships and see, okay, well, who am I now in relationship to, Babar when I was 6 years old, or whoever it might be, right? Who am I now?
right.
That process of always coming home. I think it
Yeah.
was also LaKayla Gwynn who spoke a lot about that, always coming home, always finding home in a new place. I think that speaks a lot to the queer experience too.
And understanding that, just like there was a part of myself that made sense at the time and doesn't now, that's taking certain people off of my ancestral altar, even if they were there for 15, 20 years,
Mm.
and being like, I don't need you every day. Or we've got enough of a relationship now, it doesn't need to be affirmed, or whatever it might be. Right. And when you talk about fictional characters, there's also this notion to me of constructs of collective beings. So
Yes.
what I mean by that is numbers of people murdered in the United States by police, right? That's not an individual. That's putting George Floyd on my altar, putting a collective of, in the height of those protests, I put the justice card from the from one of Patrick Valencia's decks um, on the altar because I'm just like, you are a collective construct,
Mm.
justice, that symbolizes all of these people murdered,
Right.
right? Or I have a piece of candy from an installation that was done, has been done numerous times, of this giant pile of candy
Mm.
on the ground. I can't remember the name of the artist, and it just has a sign that says, "Feel free to take one." And then there's a little sign on the side that says, "The pile of candy is the exact number of people who died in the 80s from AIDS and GRID." And I picked up a piece of candy and I started to eat it. And then I read the sign and I spat it out and I wrapped the wrapper back up and I took it home
Mm.
because collectively, that is a collection from my queer ancestors. Though I know the names of certain individuals, there is also the veneration and appreciation of collectives. So I think when you're talking about whether it's fiction or constructed
Yes.
collectives, though I would offer a concern when those two intersect,
Right.
right? People saying the first Pride was a protest. No, it wasn't.
Mm.
The first Pride was based off an event in Philadelphia that was then brought to New York and was a parade of identity
Mm.
and affirming place.
Mm.
Stonewall was a protest,
Yes.
but the first Christopher Street Parade was not Stonewall. And that's where we start creating fantasies
Mm.
out of our collectives.
Mm.
And I think there's a awareness to have within that that is a point for me of wariness. Because I've certainly been the one who said, go Marsha P. Johnson. She was one of the first people to throw a brick at Stonewall. No, she wasn't. She had said in her own words that she was across town at the time, but she showed up. She was part of the protests, but she was not one of the first people.
Mm.
And so is it more worthwhile to listen to, say, Miss Majors talking about her experience being there at the beginning,
Right.
rather than fictionalizing our ancestors? So and so in my ancestral line was a blank. Well, were they? Or what you saying is, I venerate other people of this lineage and I don't have their names. Or I venerate within me and appreciate within me the part of me that's an artist. I don't know. I've never made art. Actually, I have, but like,
I was going to
conceptual.
say.
Never made art. I've never done it, but I think I want to in the future. And so there's a part of me that's putting artist on the altar of self. I have an entire altar area dedicated to self-love.
I was going to ask about that too. That's
Yes.
perfect. Perfect segue. Please continue.
Provide for the script. But building my self relationship, which can include self-love, but doesn't always.
Mhm.
Because again, not my relationship with me is not all romantic. Some of it's eros based,
Mhm.
some of it is co-worker based, some of it's co-spiritual related. Um, but in building that, it was important for me to also name things that didn't exist yet.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I it raises an interesting piece for me around that kind of very culturally based Western idea of not only self but also how we can relate to self. Years ago, a couple of years ago, I ran a single workshop, and it was creating a personal icon. What would it
Ooh,
be like
yes.
to envision ourselves as a sacred image? And I was telling a friend of mine who was on a spiritual journey, is on a spiritual journey, comes from a very evangelical background and is now in pagan sphere. And I said, what would you think of that? She said, I would feel really uncomfortable with seeing myself as an icon, of worshipping myself. And we had a whole interesting conversation around that idea of worship and venerating and envisioning self and relating in that way. Something you said about story just now, about fictionalizing narrative and what is it exactly that we're serving in latching on to those stories, those fictionals, those myths, right? What is it that we're actually latching onto there? I'm curious when you are relating to yourself through this altar, because I would say that a lot of, at least wellness people, tend to create a sacred space for themselves. That's a very long-standing tradition. What is that like for you to relate to this person you're becoming and the person you were and the person you are? What's that relationship like?
So it's interesting. I'm in the midst of moving, so like there's a part of me that's like keeps wanting to indicate to where my altar is, and I'm like, it's
It's not
not
there.
there. That's just a random pile of boxes, and it's not even the right boxes for my altar. Anyway, but on my main altar, I have altars dedicated to different deities. My ancestral altar is elsewhere, but to different deities. Um, one that I serve, one that I have a devotional relationship with. Um, one for my inner sense of innocence or youthfulness, or whatever that term might be. One that is dedicated to my oracular working. That is where I keep the cursed cards, as it were. And then one that is for, I'll call it authenticity. And I have on it a necklace that you can flip between pronouns that I was wearing for a hot minute. And then I just went, you know what, I don't need to have that out for the world to see every moment. I get to choose who I share pronoun complexities with.
Mm.
Um, that has just different pieces of artwork on it. But the reason I named that I have different parts of me, and I am very blessed in the fact that I have the capacity to have that much physical space. I honor and name that not everybody has that kind of living life experience, right? Um, But I think for me, breaking it down into roles that I serve, parts of my past that are still somewhere in me, and the journey that I am on currently and into the future has helped my brain a little bit in that question. But I think everybody approaches this notion of how do you look at your own life? For example, I know a lot of transgender people who use words like dead name. That is my
Yes.
dead name. Please never call me by my dead name. I don't use that language. In fact, I actively dislike it for my journey
Mhm.
because I still use the same magical working name, or at least a variation of it. So I might have a different public name or legal name,
Yes.
um, but or that's my past
Mm.
name. But if you are someone for whom dead name is a truth for you, building an altar to your past might actually be emotionally activating
Absolutely.
in a really negative way.
Mhm.
And so I think it's worth considering looking at how you look at your own life if you are considering doing that sort of work.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I
I
mean,
think
actually, I
oh,
think of vision boards or dream boards, right? How
yes.
is that not people looking into how they want to manifest their future self? That's a version of all of this. It just happens to involve ribbons and cutouts from magazines.
Pretty pictures. Yes, no, absolutely. Well, and that's the thing. Coming to my last question, that piece around culture and what you've been noticing throughout your work, going and traveling across many different cultures, even if they're Western cultures, the differences there. I want to make one little comment here, though. That idea of dead air naming. That's something that I've been struggling with myself, as somebody who gave up my birth name a long time ago. I had a really interesting conversation with a classmate. I'm currently at university taking some classes, and quite young, very early 20s, came out and started transitioning about a year ago, and comes from a Persian background. And I think for at least the trans community can be so Western in so many ways, can be so focused on kind of inflicting a Western idea of what gender should be and how we should relate to it. They said, he said, when I'm at home, I'm always going to be the Persian daughter to my parents, and I love my parents. So why don't I just continue being the Persian daughter for them? That understanding of that relationship to their parents, and their parents have switched to starting to relate to them as a boy and starting to relate to them as the person they are, while also reflecting and respecting that Persian daughter that he used to be. And I think it's a very interesting thing that we even the queer community get locked into the culture of what we should or should not be doing, even when we're exploring ourselves. It's very fascinating and difficult conversation to have, right?
And I think it's interesting when we look at venerating our ancestors in the construct of this, piece, is who do we have as models? The number of transgender men I have met who early on in their journeys become misogynists or alcoholics or have some degree of verbal or physical violence in how they present
Yes.
themselves. Uh, it's because oftentimes there's a veneration that's happening on the quest for self through the models who have come before. And so if all you have is toxically masculine stories of what manhood looks like, it makes sense. And if what you have in, say, I grew up in the United States, um, is if what you have as your model is, two parents or one parent at home with no one else supporting them and a cutoff from your family at large,
Mm.
your journey of self in its intersection with like how you want to operate in the world at large might not have space for the creative force beyond the examples you've seen. And so people continuing the patterns based on what they've seen before becomes generational, becomes locational, becomes religious or community based. That if that's all you've seen, and so in the case of, well, of course I'm going to be a good Persian daughter to my Persian parents, my mother struggled with the fact that I was going to get rid of my first name because literally our family went to blows over it. Not metaphor, that is literal. And so the fact that she had a name that was also a pagan deity mattered to her. And so the idea that I was not going to keep that. And so as long as my mother was alive, I kept that as my middle name as a way to show my love for the lineage I am with. And therefore, we have, as individuals, whether it's around names or around behaviors or around gender or around anything, it is the complexity of the exposures you've had. Hell, if I had grown up in Hawaii, like, and not just grown up, but been indigenous, the word mahu and the way it interrelates with culture, I have so much more, like, my tongue lights up with the possibilities of dream the moment I hear that word and the ways it intersects with culture, including in the face of the attempted cultural destruction of Mahu individuals, right? Not just cultural, but literal,
Yes.
massacre. And I also own that I'm a white dude. So don't do that. But when I learned about Mahu people, when I was visiting family in Hawaii, like I went, oh, this, but I had never dreamed that dream.
Right.
And so it can be cultural, locational, or even generational. My mother, growing up the oldest of five, two half siblings, two adopted, and then having an additional family that she wasn't part of, her experience of I am not alone looks very different than mine as a single child.
Right.
Looks very different than my grandmother being the youngest of 13 that made it past 1 year old. Her understanding of we are not alone, and this is what family does for family, is very different. And therefore, the idea of I take care of myself, I think a very, like when I've had conversations with a friend of mine, Guan Xuan, who's from Taiwan, like very different understanding based on the idea that self and family aren't separate.
Yes.
Your self is inherently familial. And so their sense of self and doing this work for them and their current relationships and how that intertwines is inherently going to involve their biological family.
Absolutely.
And so when we say things like, well, you have to work on this by yourself, you have to work on this with you, who says? Why can't I do it with the rest of the people on my, trying to choose a random sport, on my lacrosse team, right? Why can't everyone in my quilting circle all do this work together, cheering each other on?
Yeah.
My quilting group becomes part of my self. And I love that.
That's powerful. That's powerful. That's classic collectivist culture right there. Right? Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges is people think you have to choose one or the other.
No, you don't.
There is a reason I have an ampersand tattooed on the inside of my wrist, and is one of the most powerful and creative forces on this planet. I really believe that.
Thank you. I have so many other questions for you, but we have come up to time. However, I'm going to let other podcasters and other interviewers ask those questions. I guess the last question, and it's a cliche question, but I am
Bring it on.
curious. What do you hope people will get out of this book? I know it's a cliche question.
That your relationship with yourself doesn't have to look like anyone else's. Dream creatively. Be courageous with yourself and make the shape of relationship that's right for you.
Mm,
Right? Do what actually serves you. Yeah, we'll aim with that.
I love that. Thank you so much, Lee Harrington.
It has been an absolute delight. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. I'll put everybody. Apparently, you're everybody now. I will put all of your socials down below. Please go and follow Lee on Facebook, Instagram, all of the other things. Check out their books and check out my cat also wants you to check out their books. And join us next week for our next guest, who is Matthew Venus. I'm going to just put this on straight after we're done because I've loved this chat. And Lee, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with us all today.
You take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.